Tatsalak. Can you say that? That means good afternoon in the language that Kaya's people, the Nez Perce or the Nimipu, spoke. Tatsalak, they would say to each other if they saw each other in the afternoon. I want to begin talking to you with a little bit of a story of my own, because that's how Kaya's and all her people shared their information and learned about things. And I thought that maybe the best way for me to tell you is to tell you how I first got to know her. And it all started with a phone call from an editor at Pleasant Company. And she said, "Hello, Dottie. We've been thinking about doing a Welcome to Kaya's World. Like the other books in this series, there's a Welcome to Felicity's World, Welcome to Samantha's World, Welcome to Kit's World. We want to do one for Kaya, and we would like you to write it." And I was thrilled, because I love finding out new things and about new cultures. I knew nothing about Kaya. The books weren't available yet. They were just being written, the fiction books by Janet Shaw. And so I hadn't even read one single story of Kaya's. So I told my editor, I would love to do this, but I don't know anything about the Nez Perce. And I don't know anything about Kaya's life. And she said, "That's okay. We've been working on these Kaya fiction books for 5 years. And all the researchers at Pleasant Company have so much information. They've been going out to where Kaya lives. They've been talking to people of the Nez Perce tribe. They've been learning all about Kaya." One of those people is Kathy Bukowski over here. She's a historian at Pleasant Company. And I brought her along because she knows much more than I do. And so if I get stumped by one of your questions, I'm hoping that Kathy's going to be able to help me out with that. Have any of you ever written a report, like in school? Yeah. What's the first thing that you do? When, let's say you had to write a report on, say, a cougar or something like that, what would be one thing that you would do? Yeah. I first went to the encyclopedia, and both the encyclopedia in a book and the encyclopedia on the internet. And I found out a bunch of stuff about Kaya. I found out where she lives. Now, some of you won't be able to see this, but this is a map that Kathy made that has all the American girls on it. I'll hold it up a little bit. Now, can one of you girls in the front row, can you come on up and see if you can point out where Kaya is? Do you see Kaya? Yeah, that's where she is. This whole area was originally Kaya's homeland, the homeland of the Nimipu. Now, the Nez Perce reservation is right here where Kaya's base is. It's much, much smaller than it was originally. And I learned when I was going through the encyclopedia all about how Kaya's people had lived in this area for thousands and thousands of years. Long, long before the Europeans started coming to what we now call the United States. Some of you might know Felicity. Her stories take place in 1774. Kaya's take place in 1764. But they would never have met. Kaya's people had never seen what they eventually called people with pale faces and hairy faces, which were the Europeans who began to settle the United States and settled North America and eventually moved west. At the time that Kaya's stories take place, no one had seen these people, although some French traders later did run into Kaya's people, and 2 very famous explorers at one point, about 50 years after Kaya's stories take place, 2 very famous explorers called Lewis and Clark crossed these mountains, and it was Kaya's people who saved them from starvation and let them go on their way. So I learned all about that. I learned all about some not so pleasant stuff, like the Nez Perce War, and how the U.S. government eventually took land away from the Nez Perce so that European settlers could settle on it. And when the Nimipu didn't want to have that happen, it eventually ended up being a war called the Nez Perce War in 1877. During Kaya's time, none of that had happened. The Nimipu were a strong, strong people and who were proud of their life, and they had all sorts of trade and interaction with all sorts of other tribes all over this area. I learned all that kind of stuff just by looking in the encyclopedia. I didn't really think that that would be enough to make a book. What I really wanted to know was what would make girls interested in Kaya's life. What would girls want to know about Kaya? And I have a daughter of my own, and so I thought, I wonder what Elsie would like to know. And one of the things that I thought that she would like to know is, what was Kaya's life like? What did Kaya do when she woke up in the morning? What's the first thing that you do when you wake up in the morning? Kaya got out of bed too, but her bed is a little bit different than your bed. Her bed the bottom of her bed was made out of something like this. A mat like this. And she would sleep on this. It would be bigger, of course. Thank you. She would sleep on this, and she would put bison cover or bearskin, perhaps, a skin of a very furry animal over her, and she would be just as snug as can be. And when she got up in the morning and got dressed, she would roll this up, just like this, and put it over to the side of the teepee that she lived in, or the longhouse. And I'll tell you a little bit more about teepees and longhouses. And she would go to, she would stand out of the door of her teepee, and she would say a prayer to the Creator, thanking the Creator for keeping her safe through the night, and for the land that was given to the Nimipu to, for their food and for their shelter. And that's how she would start the day. After she gave thanks to the Creator, the next thing she had to do was go take a bath. Kaya didn't have a bathtub. She had what was called a sweat lodge. And the sweat lodge was a sort of hut-shaped, sort of a hut. And in the center of the hut were hot stones that had been heated over the fire. And Kaya and all of the other girls and women would go into this sweat house and pour water on these stones, and it would make a great steam, which would cleanse their bodies, would keep them clean. And then do you know what they had to do? They had to jump in the cold, cold river. Every single day, no matter what the weather was, winter, summer, they jumped in that cold river and they splashed around and got clean. Maybe somebody, probably not Kaya, since she was so venturesome, but maybe a child would not want to quite to do that and would say, I don't feel like swimming in the cold river this morning. But they would do that because they knew that that was part of who they were. Now the whip woman, have any of you read one of Kaya's books with the whip woman in it? Yeah. The whip woman was the person who would discipline anybody who misbehaved. But she wouldn't just discipline the person who misbehaved. She would discipline every child. Because Kaya's people knew that what one person did affected everybody else. She didn't go to school like you do. She learned by doing the work that was needed to keep her people alive. One of the things that she would do, one part of her work, would be to make these mats. going to pass this around, but what do you think this might be made out of? It's made out of reeds called tule. And tule is found along rivers, the sides of river. And when they're put together like this and made into a mat, they can be very useful. And in fact, for Kaya's people, they were extraordinarily useful. Because, you know, besides sleeping on the tule mats, or using them sort of like a placemat to put food on, or to dry the foods that they ate, they also used them to cover their homes. I want to show you a picture of one of the homes that the Nez Perce had. In the springtime, they would go to the camas fields where they would dig for roots for their food, camas roots, which I'll show you a little later. In the summertime, they went to the rivers where the salmon were swimming upstream to lay their eggs. As the snows melted in the mountains, they would go up to the mountains and gather berries, or the men would hunt deer and elk and mountain sheep. And then when it got cold and the snows came again, they would go back into the canyons, which were protected, and they would make more permanent houses called longhouses. But while they were traveling, this is the kind of house that they lived in, the teepee. And you can see how these mats covered the poles. And the extraordinary thing about these is that when it rained, these reeds, the tule, would swell. And so it would, once these swelled, it would close all this area, these places where there's air getting through, so the rain wouldn't come in because these would swell. But then when it was dry and hot, these would shrink back again, and then you'd have all these nice little spaces where air could come through. So it was the perfect covering for a teepee. And it was the women and the girls who built these houses. Now during the winter time, they lived in more permanent, larger houses. You can see how big these houses are, right? As many as 20 families would live in one of these all winter. And they would share, they'd have maybe 4 or 5 different fires in here, and they would share their fires between 2 families or 3 families maybe. But these were a little bit warmer. They were more protected. They had more mats on them and more poles, which kept them a little bit more protected from the snows. But then once again, when the spring came, it would be time to leave this area, leave this protection, and begin to travel and live in teepees again. So that's what they did. Spring, summer, fall, winter, they moved around and they moved their homes with them. So one of the things that Kaya would do would be to make these mats. Another thing that she would do is she would make one of these. She would help make these. These are called parfleches. Here, I'm going to pass this around so that you can see these. These are called parfleches, and these were their suitcases. When I travel, I have a suitcase that's sort of like this, and pretty heavy. I like to have it on wheels. But Kaya's people could not do that. They were riding horses, and they had to keep things pretty light and movable. So a parfleche was the perfect suitcase for them. It was made out of rawhide, and it folded. This is very stiff, so you can't really see inside, but it folded so you could tuck all your things inside of it. Tools that you needed, food, all your dress, all the clothing, everything that you wanted to carry with you, you could tuck right in there. And this would fit perfectly on a horse's back or on a travois. Now to make one of these, what do you think this is made out of? It's actually made out of a skin, out of rawhide, out of an animal skin. And so to make these, they would have to first pull the skin really tightly as tight as they possibly could. And then they would use one of these. This is a scraper. And they would scrape as much of the muscle and other innards off of the skin as they possibly could. Scrape, 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 which took a lot of strong arms. And then they would put the skin in ashes. Am I correct? In ashes. And that would loosen the hair off of the, because if this were on a buffalo, it would have hair on it, wouldn't it? So they wanted to get the hair off, so they would take all the hair off. And again, what would they use? The big scraper. And they would scrape, 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 scrape some more. And then they would stretch it. They would stretch it again, and I have a picture here. Oops. Thank you. I have a picture of how this is stretched, and how they would scrape it. And then after that, they would use animal brains to cover the skin so that it would become waterproof. Now, one of our advisory board, our Nez Perce advisory board members, told Kathy a story about how she was trying to do this in the traditional way one time, and she had a skin in a garbage can in her backyard, and she had it soaking in this solution, and it was so smelly that her neighbors began to complain.
Dottie, I grabbed the phones.
Oh, great. Thank you. Now, after they had this beautiful skin all nicely stretched out and waterproofed, and maybe it didn't smell quite so terrible anymore, then it would become time to paint it. See how these gorgeous shapes that are painted onto it? But the Nez Perce didn't have paintbrushes like you and I use, or paints. What they would use, these are bison bones. And what they would use is these bison bones as paintbrushes. And they would lay twigs along so that they would make their lines nice and straight and geometric. And who can tell me what this is? It looks like mud. Yeah, it's minerals. It's rocks, or if it were wet, it would be mud. Yeah. This was a lot of the paint came from earth material, like these minerals. Some might come from berries. Some might come from other plants, bark. And they would dip these bones into the paint that they made from all these wonderful materials, and then they would paint on these. They had to work very fast, though, because paint soaks into these very easily. So they'd have to work very fast and be very efficient. I'm going to pass these things around. Don't clobber each other with this, though. Now, here's some other rawhide.
Tanned hide.
Tanned hide, sorry. Parfleshes weren't the only thing that they made, that they used these skins for. So another thing that Kaya would have learned to do, and part of her daily work would have been to help her grandmother or her mother make dresses. Now, I'm going to pass these around too. It took two deer skins to make one dress. You'd use one deer skin for the front and one deer skin for the back. And other deer skin as well for the fringe. Am I correct there?
Actually the fringe would just be fringed off of the ends of, because it's the tail, the legs, the rear legs form the sleeves, and the longer portion on the bottom are actually the forelegs.
Right. And then you'll see up here just a little dark spot. See that little dark spot on the doll's dress? That's the deer's tail. And that was saved out of respect for the deer, because the Nimipu felt that the deer had given himself or herself up to make a dress, and they would thank the deer for that and use this as a way of showing the deer that they respected the sacrifice that the deer had made so that they could wear their dress, so that they could be clothed. Now, you can see other things along here too. What are some other things that are on this dress? For Kaya, for her everyday, she probably wouldn't have a lot of beads on her dress. But for a special occasion, like a ceremony, like a giveaway or a wedding giveaway, then they would. They'd wear very special dresses. If you've read the story where Kaya's big sister is promised in marriage to a man, during that ceremony she has a special dress that she wears that's very heavily beaded. Some of the beads that Kaya would use are called dentalia. Dentalium is a shell that comes from the Pacific Ocean. But if you'll remember the map that I showed you, the land that Kaya lived on is not close to the Pacific Ocean. It's quite a ways away.
Here's where Kaya is.
How do you think they would get these shells? Yep, you're close, aren't you? Yeah, they would go to a place where they could trade with other people, with other tribes. And these they got from trading with tribes that lived on the Pacific coast. So they would meet with these tribes, and they would get these. These were very, very special. So just a few of these would be worth a lot of things in trade. I think I read where.
As you got farther, when you get farther inland, like especially if you got into the plains, a couple of strings of dentalium shells would get you a horse.
Would be worth
very
a horse.
Valuable.
So when I pass these around, be careful with them.
These are also
worth a
really
horse.
large ones. They also were often seen much smaller.
Very small.
Variety of sizes.
Now these are very interesting. They also would be used to decorate a dress. And these look like beads, but you know what they really are? They're elk's teeth. They're the teeth of elks. And elk only had 2 front teeth that looked like this. And so these two were very, very rare. And if you had elk's teeth on your dress, that meant that you were doing pretty okay by yourself. So elk's teeth, dentalium. Other shells, they would use other shells that they would find in, they would either trade with people from the coast, or else some of the shells they would find in the rivers where they fished for salmon. And these little guys are bone. They're made out of bone. So they would also make beads out of bone. And then these blue beads were the most special of all. And that's because they came all the way from Russia. Now, how do you think they might have gotten them from Russia? Yep, you're right. They traded. That's exactly what happened. Somehow, some of the tribes who lived on the coast would have interaction with explorers or traders that came from Russia. They would get these glass beads, and eventually they would find their way over to where the Nez Perce were. And as more and more Europeans came into the land, then more and more glass beads became available and traded. So, not in Kaya's time so much, but a little bit later you start seeing a lot of more glass beads and even brass beads. There's a brass bead here that you might find on there, on one of those dresses. And I'll pass those around. Now to sew a dress, Kaya would use this. And this comes from this. Now this looks like maybe it's a weed or something, but it's not. It's called sinew. It's a muscle that comes from an animal that they hunted. And they would tear this apart and moisten it and turn it into thread that they would use. Now while she's sewing, she would use what's called an awl, which is just a little sharp tool. And she would make holes where she needed to sew. And then she would put the string, or the thread, the sinew, through those holes. And this is very interesting. You know where she would keep this little ball of sinew? In her mouth. And that's so that it would stay nice and moist for her to, so that she could work with it very carefully. So that's a perfect place to keep it so that your animals don't start walking away with it or whatever. But they didn't have needles necessarily. They used an awl to poke the holes, and then they wove this through. Like to see these. Another thing that Kaya would do to help out with, to learn about the things that she needed to do to help her people survive, is that she would, I'll get him. She would make baskets. Baskets are what were used for almost everything. They were used for gathering food. They were used for cooking food. They were used for carrying things, for storing things. They were even used for hats. I don't know if you've seen a picture of Kaya with her hat on. I don't know if we have a picture.
There's a picture on the
top. Oh, here are the hats.
There.
Yeah, here. These hats. Now, to make baskets, she would use grass, hemp, or this is called bear grass. And I'll pass this around because you'll need to feel this and see how sharp it is. I've thought about doing this before, and I thought my fingers probably wouldn't be able to hold up. It's so sharp. And what she would do, Kathy started this. In fact, Kathy has made a number of these. What she would do is that she would use these, and sometimes sometimes she would dye them using all those wonderful things that we talked about before. And then she would twist the dyed threads around the other threads over and over and over and over again, making it as tight as can be. And eventually she would come up with this. And if you look very closely at this, you'll be able to see that this is very old, but you'll be able to see that there are patterns that were made, beautiful patterns that were made by using differently dyed bear grass. So I'll pass this around. This basket was made a little bit differently. This is called a coiled basket, right? Mm-hmm. And it was made with cedar bark.
Cedar bark root.
And what they would do is they would put strips of cedar bark around like this, and then weave those together. You'll see this is much, much stronger, and this is so tight that it would probably hold water. And the Nez Perce didn't have pots and pans like we do. So these would need to, let's say to cook fish, you would fill a basket like this with water, drop hot stones into it to get that water nice and hot, and that's how you would cook your fish. Pass these around too. All my goodies back here. Now, one of the areas that Kaya and her family and her people went to were called the camas field. And that was the first food that they would have after a long, long winter of no food. And what they would do is they would dig for, the women and girls would dig for camas bulbs. And they would put they would carry one of those flat baskets. They're a little bit more square. You'll see here you can see,
There's a...
oops, a woman with a basket on. She would carry that, and this is Camus right here, and use a digging stick like this to dig in and lift the bulb, and then she would put the bulbs in her bag. When they got home, when they got back to the camp, would they cook these before they mashed them?
They would use them in a variety of ways. They would either roast them whole, and they would dig a pit and carefully, slowly roast them, or you could take and let them dry and grind them up and use them sort of like flour to make the little finger cakes, where you take and you put a little dough in your hand and close your fingers around it to make a little finger cake.
A little finger cake that they could then pack very easily when they were traveling. So they would always have a little snack with them when they traveled. The other, maybe I'll do the pass. The other main, thank you. The other main food of the Nez Perce, one of the other main foods of the Nez Perce, was of course salmon. And every summer they would follow the salmon as they went up the river to lay their eggs. And very often the Nez Perce would collect at a certain place called Celilo Falls with other tribes. And they would all get together and all do the fishing. They often use spears to fish, or sometimes nets. I have a net back here. And they would stand on tall, tall platforms and lean over the rushing waters and spear the fish from tall, tall platforms, which sounds pretty scary to me, actually. I don't think I'd like to be up there that high. Another thing that they would use for their food is the buffalo. And these are arrowheads. Mostly the men went on the buffalo hunts. The women would go along in order to prepare the food after they killed the buffalo. But they would use, these are arrowheads that are made out of rock, and they would put these on the end of long sticks. Do we know what kind of sticks?
I think generally just the point was getting them as straight as you could. So.
And then sometimes feathers on the back, and that's how they would. And oftentimes, they would travel many miles to hunt these buffalo. They weren't the Nimipu weren't originally hunters of buffalo. They didn't go on buffalo hunts until they had the horse. The Nimipu were especially good horse people. Has anybody seen pictures of the Appaloosa horses with the spots on the back? That's the kind of horse that the Nimipu were known for breeding. But they didn't breed them especially to have spots on them. They bred them mostly for sure-footedness and speed. And that's why Kaya, as we know, is such a good horsewoman. It was very, very important to her family, to her people, for them to be able to ride well and to be able to control their horses well. Want to see these? Now, Kaya also got to have fun. She didn't work all the time. She had other things that she could do. And a lot of the toys that the Nez Perce children used were really kind of small versions of what they would have when they were adults. So they would have, for example, they would make themselves dolls using the same tanned hides, and they would stuff these dolls probably with milkweed
pod mosses.
And mosses. Now this would be almost exactly the way Kaya would have been carried when she was an infant. Babies were strapped into these called cradle boards, into the cradle boards, and this little pocket was stuffed with something else that's pretty amazing, and that's this. I'm not sure that you can tell what this is, but it's moss. And this soft, soft moss is what they would use as diapers. They would stuff this in here and use it as diapers. They also use this, I think, to put in their moccasins every now and then as well. Yeah.
In the winter.
And so the cradle boards would have a strap on them so that they could hang them over the horn of their saddle. And that's how the baby would ride when the mom and the baby were traveling from place to place. Everything that Kaya had made it easy to travel, because that's the life that they led. That's how they got their food. Now, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time here, whether... Okay, I have just one thing that I want to do first, and then I will. I wanted to make sure that you know that the Nez Perce are still a very active people in our country today. They live, as I pointed out on the map, there's a Nez Perce reservation there, and about 4,000 Nez Perce people live on that reservation, and then all over the United States and all over the world. And many of the children now are beginning to, or continuing, some of the same traditions that even Kaya learned. Beading, basketry. They go to camps where they learn how to take care of horses, the way Kaya took care of high steps. They take part in other activities that are meant to save some of the creatures that were sacred to the Nimipu, the salmon and wolves. And best of all, they get together regularly for what's called a powwow. And this picture right here is
also, I should add, the other thing that they do at Culture Camp and throughout their school year is they take classes in the traditional language and Nez Perce language.
This is the original painting of one of the pictures that's in the book, the very last picture in the book. And the artist and the art director were very, very kind to let me bring it here. It's very precious to them. But you can see in this picture that some of the costumes follow the traditional costume, like Kaya has on here, but there are also modern costumes. And these are over here. This is called a shawl costume. Fancy shawl dress. And you can see the fringe. So imagine seeing a group of girls dressed like this, all dancing and dipping, and they bring the shawls up and down, and it looks like a whole bunch of beautiful birds just flying and flapping. This dress, oops, sorry, this dress is called the jingle dress, and I bet you can figure out why. And these originally were made out of, believe it or not, the tops of tobacco tins. And they were bent around and attached here. And that makes gorgeous noise when the girls are dancing. And they're different dances, right? Girls can either dance in the traditional dances, in the fancy shawl dance, or in the jingle dress dance. And boys dance too.
And they compete.
And they drum. And they compete for costume
prizes?
or for the dance?
Both. Both. They're judged on their costume as well as their dancing.
So the culture is alive and kicking today. It's very, very active and very strong.